other people might not always recognize that they're there. Paranatural world, and that kind of led into me being more comfortable to an extent with engaging in these very fringed subjects in my professional life. So we might come back to that point a little later. Really leaning into any anxieties that I have around the stigmas that are associated with a lot of these subjects. Sasquatch, parallels, alien, ET, hauntings, a lot of these other entity encounters like
Dr. David S.B. Mitchell, thank you so much for being here for Chung Huong Institute podcast. Dr. Mitchell, you fascinate me because you are so interdisciplinary. You're doing research on Sasquatch, which is so I've never heard of before you last year, and then you're in the psychological field. You are helping so many students. Can you share a little bit about yourself for our listeners?
Yeah, thank you. So, some of the scholarship that you just mentioned that I started working on a few years ago around Sasquatch and some of these other kind of fringed areas of study, as I like to think of them, that began for me really when I was pretty young. And I have always had this kind of intuition or something to that effect that there are just odd things in the world or things that go bump in the night. Not necessarily odd in a bad way, but odd in the sense that other people might not always recognize that they're there, right? And so, yeah, as a kid, I was really interested in the natural world. I wanted to be a veterinarian or marine biologist or naturalist, something having to do with animals in the natural world when I was younger. And while that kind of interest never left me, and that interest in the kind of weirder sides of the natural world or paranatural world, and that we might call it perhaps, that interest went kind of underground as I got older. And in the last few years, thankfully, I've gotten more kind of reabsorbed into those interests of mine, in large part thanks to our colleague, Dr. Jake Glazier, who invited me to do as well as a book chapter a few years ago on some of these kind of weirder interests of mine, and that led into my re-emergence or more explicit professional interest and engagement in homin entity encounters, and homins being all these hairy bipeds, human-like beings that are reported throughout the literature, both in oral history and natural history, in eyewitness reports, and folklore, mythology throughout the world. So that kind of speaks to that interdisciplinary part that you were talking about of my interest and background. And so it also overlaps significantly with my interest in transpersonal psychology. So yeah, Dr. Glazier invited me to do the book chapter and the talk, and that kind of led into me being more comfortable to an extent with engaging in these very fringed subjects in my professional life. And so I kind of along with that try to engage in it in a way that is, as you mentioned, at least interdisciplinary, if not aiming for a transdisciplinary approach in collaboration with colleagues, for example. But it's also an opportunity to practice kind of listening to myself intuitively and kind of trying to practice a beginner's mind to an extent. And we might come back to that point a little later. And to really leaning into any anxieties that I have around the stigmas that are associated with a lot of these subjects and Sasquatch parallels a lot of these other entity encounters like alien entity encounters, so-called ET entity encounters, hauntings and things like that. And all of these are kind of a part and parcel in my eyes of what we can look at in transpersonal psychology is as entity encounters under the kind of general rubric of entity encounters. So yeah, I'm really excited to continue to engage in this subject and to more or less kind of push the boundaries of what both transpersonal psychology is doing and also what some of the more traditional disciplines or fields that have looked at Sasquatch and other entity encounters have been doing, such as what's called hominology, the study of homins, and cryptozoology, the study of cryptids.
Yeah, I love that you're
Very
always pushing boundaries. I feel
yeah.
like, but you're doing it respectfully. That's the
Mhm,
difference, right? There are people who push boundaries and they're like, yeah, it doesn't matter what happens. Let's just do it. But you're not doing that way.
thank
So
you.
you mentioned transpersonal psychology several times. For those who are not familiar with it, can you just define and explain it briefly?
Yeah, yeah. So there's different definitions out there, as you are well aware, but the basic definition, or a basic definition, is the study of ways in which the mind, the brain, kind of go beyond the ego, go beyond the person, as it were, which the latter of which are kind of focused on in mainstream psychology. And so transpersonal psychology, trans being beyond or through, really refers to going beyond the person.
Mm.
And so one of the things that I'm, again, particularly interested in, and that a lot of transpersonal psychologists, researchers, academicians, etc., are interested in, is the study of exceptional human experiences. And so exceptional human experiences are really all of the things that can really push humans beyond a sense of the mundane, the everyday, and invite us into a world that's either just a tad bit beyond that or is way beyond the everyday. And so transpersonal psychologists have an opportunity to kind of reinsert the soul or spirit into psychology. There was a famous quote by Dr. Woodsworth back in the day where he had commented on, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he had commented on how psychology had lost its mind and had lost its soul, had lost its consciousness. And so he was commenting on the kind of various movements within, or forces within, psychology at the time. And transpersonal psychology is, in effect, an attempt to reassert some of this, to reassert the spirit or soul of psychology, and to ideally do so respectfully, to the word that you used earlier. And it is also a kind of rebuffing or rebuke, to an extent, against the ways in which psychology has lost its sense of itself in some ways. And so transpersonal psychology is largely about reasserting what might, in some senses, be considered to be the oldest identity of psychology. So if you look at psychology as the study of the psyche, and if you understand that psyche, or if you look at psyche through its Greek lens, being soul, or more broadly mind, and if you look at the Egyptian origins of psyche as Sahu, or Sakhu, Sakhu, which is essentially the illuminated within, the light within, which is a potentially looked at as a general reference to the soul. You can see that psychology, the study of the light within, the soul, etc., is an invitation, or at least could very well be an invitation to do what transpersonal psychology has been attempting to do since the late 60s, since its inception. So that's one thing. And transpersonal psychology is also, again, an opportunity to look at exceptional human experiences, what Rhea White, the late parapsychologist and feminist scholar, critical parapsychologist, defined as exceptional human experiences. And so what she was attempting to do was to essentially bridge parapsychology and transpersonal psychology by saying, well, what are some ways in which we can take parapsychology out of the lab, out of solely an experimental lens, and marry it to the fact that these are people who are having these experiences, people in process, people in their daily lives, etc., who at some point might want to try to integrate these weird or odd experiences, from deja vu to, again, entity encounters, into their daily lives. And so what she was doing was developing a kind of taxonomy of, and categorization of, different types of ways in which people can experience the exceptional.
It's really
So
interesting because in today's world, everyone's having some sort of exceptional experience, right? We have deja vu. We have moments of lucid dreaming. We have moments where we're just something startles us, we jump. And yet, transpersonal psychology is never considered high impact in research, right? or I have not seen it. Maybe it has been and I haven't come across it. So I'm just curious, what do you think, Dr. Mitchell, it would take for transpersonal psychology to be accepted? And maybe why is it not accepted? And I understand this is quite a loaded question.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. It's an important question. So one thing that the transpersonal psychology and other psychologies have attempted to do is to reestablish, to understand, to define, and hopefully predict and impact human flourishing. And so it is important, I think, for human sciences such as transpersonal psychology to really advocate that, to really assert and insert themselves as psychologists, as scientists, researchers, academicians, as people potentially in dialogue with citizen scientists, those lay people who are really interested in some of these dialogues, some of these phenomena, etc. And with lay people who might not be citizen scientists themselves, but who might have an interest in, as you're saying, kind of where the rubber meets the road, essentially, in terms of how we think about and understand ourselves as human beings in dialogue with each other, in dialogue with the broader world and the cosmos. So I think that continued advocacy can help. I think that continued reaching beyond the global north, beyond solely European paradigms and European American paradigms can be helpful. Continuing to look at ways in which people of color, indigenous communities, both inside and outside of Europe, can be brought in to, or if not brought into, recognized more fully. And these kinds of endeavors can be really helpful. And so I think that those are some of the ways in which the kind of bridge can be built. Another thing is that some individuals have talked about how phenomena like and concepts like mindfulness have really transpersonal roots, but transpersonal psychologists might not have always done the best at, again, advocating for or recognizing where that bridge has been, that those associations have been in the past. And so, yes, peer-reviewed journals and conferences are really important. And we also need to do the other thing, which is, again, being in dialogue with individuals outside of the academy, dialogue with institutes, with ways in which we can really expand beyond the ivory tower.
You mentioned people of color, and I'm just going to ask a really curious question. Recently, you've taught me about Black psychology. I've never even heard of the term. I've never heard of that before. So I was really fascinated and still am. And I'm curious if you can mention what is that, why it's important, and how does that connect to transpersonal, and why more psychologists should know about it. Again, very broad question.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. So it's interesting. Black psychology developed in essentially the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, the late 1960s, in part as a response to a lack of visibility, a lack of recognition within the larger American Psychological Association. And so either a lack of recognition, a lack of kind of visibility, or a blatant pushing against people of color, in this case specifically Black folk in America, North America, the United States specifically. So Black psychology as a whole, though, isn't simply reactionary. It is an attempt to reassert the humanness and the Pan-African that is both in continental Africa and beyond in the diaspora, philosophies and culture in ways that are academically and clinically rigorous. And so the Association of Black Psychologists, ABPSI, was established in the late 60s and continues to this day in its impact and attempts very much like transpersonal psychology to reassert a sense of how can we help humans to flourish. And so there is very much a transpersonal ideal, a transpersonal vision within Black psychology. It's always been there. Individuals like Dr. Nobles, Dr. Wade Nobles, and Dr. Linda James Myers, and others, numerous others, Dr. Edward Bruce Bynum, BYNUM. They have they and others have done this work and have looked back into the past in terms as ancient, as archaic as ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, to the present and into the future in terms of attempting to reassert and reestablish what are some of the themes within African and Black culture that have persisted, and how they've been tied to other cultures outside of the Black community or African community, and what are some ways in which we can utilize that wisdom and knowledge to move forward more healthily and more communally. So there are definitely linkages there, for example, with the extending vector of transpersonal development that Dr. Michael Daniels talks about. The extending vector kind of being like the yoga off the mat. It's what a contemplative practice looks like in practice, in concert rather with the people. And so one of the things that Dr. Nobles and others have talked about is we can't be truly human. I say we, any individual cannot be truly human without other humans. There is a cultivation of being human when we exist alongside and interact with other people. And so people like Dr. Nobles, the late Dr. A. Wade Boykin, my former graduate advisor and professor, have talked about is this communalism. And so communalism would be this social interdependence, this orientation towards social interdependence that is argued to generally exist within African culture. It's not to say that everyone who's of African descent exhibits the same or manifests the same kind of fundamental orientation, but that by and large, there is a tendency towards social interdependence, toward group duty, towards sharing and reciprocity, and towards having a sense of identity rooted in group membership. That I am not who I am because I'm off maybe in the woods somewhere by myself, but I am myself because I am in concert with others, in dialogue with the community, with a living and breathing community. And so you have people like Dr. Molefi Asante, who founded an Afrocentric approach to academia within academia. Dr. Asante talks about how it is the human is the marker of kind of the divine that's being inculcated or manifested in and through the world. And so he talks about how, for example, speaking of parapsychology, okay, to go back briefly to parapsychology and going back to this kind of idea of possession in popular culture, right? Halloween and Hallows Eve is oftentimes a really fun time for the youth in Western countries, and but it's also kind of tied to this sense of the darker side or the unseen side of reality. And so one of the things that Dr. Asante talks about is how the word possession is often used. So like in popular culture, the word possession is often used in a way that indicates something negative. In horror movies and things like that, the person got possessed by some discarnate entity, for example. But the way that Dr. Asante uses the term is the way that he understands it to occur within Black and other traditional cultures, which is that possession takes place in concert with a, a spirit, with an entity, or in concert with a community through music, through dance, and through conviviality, through rhythmically induced trance. Okay. And so that there is, instead of lack of intent, right, of for getting possessed, like we might see for example, Western popular culture, in this frame, we see possession as an intentional dialogue with the cosmos, basically, and with one's physically grounded community. So recognizing those kinds of things would be helpful for transpersonal psychology moving forward, would be helpful, and would also be helpful for continued dialogue between, for example, Black psychology and Black studies more generally, and what is tended to be typically European focused or European American focused transpersonal psychology.
It's so interesting because we know everything is interdependent, and yet the Western culture, generalizing, of course, not everybody, but generalizing, the Western culture is very, it's all about me, and there's no community, and I am an individual, right? And we see that's so harmful. And we're not, there's like no common humanity in that. And what I hear is that there's a lot of emphasis on there is no me without you, for example. So, Dr. Mitchell, what do you think it's going to take for this to really be integrated in science? We know, like in physics, right? Like we see the interconnectedness in physics and like and also in biology, we see it in neuroscience on the physical parts of the body. But again, this comes back to, or comes forward to, maybe back and forth interconnectedly to finding this mystery in the mundane.
Yeah, and thank you. So for one, I think that finding the mystery in the mundane, this phrase that I've utilized off and on, that I think kind of summarizes my interests and approach. It's really about a beginner's mind, essentially. It's not always a conscious thing necessarily, but at least sometimes when it's conscious and other times when it's not, it's an expression of the cosmos being, as you said, interdependent. And also it's the sense of there might be surprises around the corner. Some of those surprises, again, might be like with our conversation about exceptional human experiences. Some of those surprises might be relatively fleeting. Others might be ground shaking and ontologically shocking, for better or worse. That said, I think there are a lot of people out there doing good work. And while I don't think that all of that good work needs to be integrated, where and when it can be, I think it can be helpful for people to continue to attempt to manifest the beginner's mind, that kind of curiosity that we have when we're children or when we're babies, the looking at things that are novel or looking at things that new ways. And so, in terms of scholarly terms, there are a few things that we might consider. One is epistemic or epistemological humility, excuse me. And so what that really is really thinking about the episteme, which is really the collection of knowledge making practices that we hold dear, that we hold closely, and how much that ties to the science that we do, the scholarship that we produce, and having some humbleness around that can be helpful. So one of the things, again, you were mentioning my interest in Sasquatch earlier. One of the things that I find to be interesting is that there are relatively defined communities within the larger Bigfooting community, and those also who interact with it. And some people might find eyewitness accounts, eyewitness reports, eyewitness memory and testimony in general to be utter hogwash and say, oh, well, that's not even worthy of discussion. And again, it's not just within the Bigfooting or Sasquatch discussion phenomenon. You also see that or can see that in other fringed phenomena as well. Individuals really throwing daggers at eyewitness memory. And so a few things can be helpful here. One is to say, well, if you're going to attempt to do a science, oftentimes a science of anomaly starts with people's reports, starts with the very thing that a lot of people poo-poo, the eyewitness testimony, the narratives that people share, oftentimes in liminal spaces like, underground podcasts and in internet threads, like in the, you know, backgrounds of Reddit, for example. So one of the questions is, again, what types of information are important? The epistemic question. What sources of information get brought to the surface or pushed down, right, below the surface? And having a degree of humility around that to say, well, it might be that the way that I've been looking at knowledge production thus far might not always be helpful. It's been helpful in these particular ways, but there might be some ways that I can expand the discussion or that we can expand the discussion. if we're going to be truly interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary. So this epistemic humility can be really important. The beginner's mind can be really important. I think a fair amount of scholars are actually risk averse. And what I mean by that is that in order to get the grants, the funding, in order to be invited to conferences, etc., it can really be helpful for people to actually do something old but in a slightly new way, to do something old but with a slight tweak. And what I mean by something old, I mean by reestablishing a paradigm. And so what Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn, the famous renowned philosopher of science, talked about when he was attempting to define paradigms and paradigm shifts is he was really focused on, well, what are the ways in which scholars, scientists, academicians practice their trade every day? What information is found in the textbooks in high school and college classes? What are the methodologies that scientists, researchers tend to utilize when they go about their daily work? And so all of these things, what are the ways that they think about their work and reinforce that in how they write about it and disseminate it? So all of these things are kind of wrapped up in what Kuhn defined as a paradigm. And the paradigm is what constitutes, what gives structure to what he called this kind of normal science, this phase of a scientific discipline where it has structure, where it has kind of found its way, it's matured. You have the conferences, you have the peer-reviewed journals. You might also very well have the funding, have some funding from legitimate, quote unquote, legitimate organizations. So that's the normal science. But then what he said was that normal science, in order to be successful, more or less, it also has to kind of push away anomaly. The scholars, again, have to be somewhat risk averse. So if there are phenomena that seem to kind of be popping up in, for example, eyewitness testimony, speaking to social scientists here, or to those in the liberal arts even, right? If there are narratives that tend to pop up in mythology, in folklore, in everyday encounters, even to an extent in urban myth, quote unquote, urban myth and urban lore, they might actually be of interest to scientists, and they might provide some illumination on how the world works if they are looked at systematically, or if they are engaged with in a way that might be replicated sometimes, or that might be valid sometimes. But it takes some potentially epistemic humility. It takes some beginner's mind, perhaps, to get there. The ontological ambiguity is to look at a phenomenon and say, I don't know what that is. Ontology being a reference to the kind of essence of a thing. Is there a kind of true, quote unquote, nature, maybe objectively verifiable nature behind a thing? And so if people can look at a potential phenomenon and say, well, I don't know what that is. Again, the Sasquatch, the ETs, the ghosts, the entities that tend to find themselves in the liminal spaces, the kind of twilight zones of the academy, then it's easier usually for scientists, scholars, et cetera, to say, well, I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. And if there also isn't funding, if there isn't a scholarly conference around it. And fortunately, in the case of Sasquatch and these other entities, there are formal organizations and not much funding, but there are formal organizations and peer-reviewed journals that look at this stuff, which is really cool. In the case of Sasquatch, there's the Relict Hominoid Inquiry, and there's also the Journal for Scientific Exploration, the JSE, out of the Society for Scientific Exploration, the SSE. Those are some examples. So when people look to poo-poo these subjects, potential subjects of study, instead of, again, as you're pointing to, bridging the gap, as it were, looking at ways in which there can be some small collaboration with other people who are willing to engage in epistemic humility. or willing to be okay briefly, curious enough about the ontologically ambiguous that they go forward anyway. This is really important. And again, it speaks, I think, to that childlike curiosity that can be really powerful. It's what gets most. I don't know any statistics on this. Let me just throw out something. 75 of scientists, and academicians probably get into this because the childlike joy resurfaces at least sometimes when they're doing the work, right? And so for me personally, there is something really powerful about re-engaging with something that I was really interested in when I was young. It's one of my oldest memories. Oh yeah, of course there's things out there or entities, persons out there that are not like us, but who people have been encountering since time immemorial.
A lot of the scientists I've spoken to, have said to me they basically have to go black and white for a while, do the thing that you're quote unquote supposed to do because it gets funding, because it does all of whatever the status quo is. And then when they're older, they can bridge out. And I just think, why wait until you're older to bridge out, right? It's like saying, I'm going to work my whole life, blood, sweat, and tears. And then when I'm in my 70s, I'm going to go traveling. Well, I mean, it seems so limiting to me.
I understand that. If you don't mind, I'll comment briefly on that.
Yeah.
So my graduate advisor who I mentioned some moments ago, Dr. Awade Boykin, would talk to his students, myself included, about the orthodox and heterodox approaches or trajectories of study. The orthodox is, again, really the stuff that normal science has been focusing on, the things that are in or will soon be in textbooks, etc. And then the heterodox stuff is the off the beaten path and the maybe liminal stuff, the things that are kind of knocking at the door of the academy but haven't been let in yet, right? And so he talked about having these two avenues of research. And to my memory, he was more or less pursuing them at the same time. So I think starting in his graduate school years. And so it's something for every scholar or scholar in development, or even citizen scientists and those who aren't formally trained to really think about. And I think it's for everybody to come to their own decision about after some maybe contemplative moments with themselves, some at least superficial reflection, right? Hopefully deeper than that. So Dr. Boykin kind of talked about that with us explicitly and how he had these two tracks of research focused on the cognitive or experimental psychology that was more accepted, I guess, in the largely European American dominated academy. And then the other stuff, which focused on Black psychology, and particularly in this case on better understanding the ways in which culture, past experiences, etc., can be built upon to improve the schooling experiences of Black children and all other children as well. Okay. So that's Dr. Boykin was one example. And so he, I think, attempted to do both more or less at the same time, but he also understood that securing positions, if you're going to try to go for an Ivy League professorship, for example, or if you're going to try to go for a big grant, that that sometimes quote unquote playing the game, I'm saying quote unquote, I'm not saying he said that, but I'm saying quote unquote playing the game is necessary sometimes. And then you had people like the late Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Actually, both Doctors Boykin and Meldrum passed away last year, but their words still resonate and go on. Their works still resonate and go on well beyond their physical lives, their physical time here with us. So Dr. Meldrum is probably the most prominent individual who has studied Sasquatch in the last several decades, and that prominence also led him to comment through his experience on the ways in which the academy can be very cruel to individuals who try to do the heterodox work. And so he talked about how he would have sometimes students come up to him. My experience with him was Howard University in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Meldrum, Iowa State University. Excuse me, Idaho State University. Okay. So Dr. Meldrum would talk about the students who would sometimes come up to him, being familiar with his work on Sasquatch, as well as his scholarship, his more orthodox scholarship in anatomy and anthropology. And his focus was on foot morphology. He was a foot morphology specialist, human and other primate foot morphology. And he would say, well, you probably want to do the orthodox stuff first, get tenure, and then do the heterodox stuff. But again, to your point, the the institute of higher education, that is the ways in which our field, our disciplines kind of are manifested now, and we're in 2026, it's changing all the time. And I think that even for people who go the orthodox route, and then if they want to do the heterodox stuff after they get tenure, there's always some risk in doing scholarship and in putting ourselves out there. There might always be somebody who disagrees with the work that we do, even if it's relatively in step with past work. I think that it's really important for people to be in dialogue, not just I think it's important for people to be in dialogue with themselves on an individual basis, to get in touch with their intuitive capacities. And I think that other people in their discipline or in an area that they're thinking about getting into, and it's in general really important for people to not be isolated in ways that are negative for their potential development. And again, I'm talking specifically about the professoriate. So it's good to, do writing retreats by yourself or with others from time to time, like, I'm going to be participating in very, very soon. It's good for people to be able to do these things and to have both individual and community-based dialogue, small groups or otherwise, to not kind of lose sight of what's important. Because at the end of the day, a person can have the best research, the best scholarship, and I'm saying that just generally, right? Relatively speaking, even you can have the best scholarship, but if nobody reads it, it doesn't matter as much. It's good that you might feel personally fulfilled, but the work has to resonate with the community, with an academic community, with a community of lay people, etc., with clinicians, mental health professionals. That's really helpful.
And what do they I don't remember who said it, and I may be gibbering the quote a little, but what is it? "If you wanna go fast, you go alone, but if you wanna go far, you have to go together."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think this is the most important thing as human beings. People underestimate networking. People underestimate just connecting. I'm like, just talk to everybody. I think we should talk to everybody. We don't know who we're gonna connect with.
Yeah, you're a good example of that. Not judging book by its cover, but the networking, the reaching out.
Yeah.
I
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Dr.
yeah.
Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell, when it comes to contemplative practice, what would you advise students, academics, professors, researchers,
Yeah,
all the 9 yards? What would you advise them to do? Or, any suggestions at all?
question. Thank you. So what comes to mind for me immediately is my own kind of trajectory with contemplative practice. So when I was in grad school, I had this interest in meditating, and mindfulness kept coming up for me. Mindfulness kept coming up. But I had the idea in my head that one had to sit in utter silence for at least half an hour to 45 minutes and to clear their mind. And that terrified me. And so for some time, I didn't actually engage in a meditative practice. Okay. Now, I did some soul searching in between my Master's of Science degree at Howard and going back there when I eventually decided, okay, I want to go back to Howard University and finish my PhD there. I had taken time off, moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area to live with my parents, who were gracious enough to let me do that. And yeah, so I did some soul searching. And in addition to kind of figuring out, well, what am I doing right now and what do I want to do moving forward in terms of engaging in the professoriate? How much can I do with just my Master's of Science in terms of getting involved in academia? And so I did some part-time jobs and things like that. And while I was doing that, I started meditating. But the reason that I started doing so was because I came across some text, and I don't remember what it was at this point, but it said start with 5 minutes a day. So just start with 5 minutes a day. You don't have to clear your mind. Just sit. And that really helped. And maybe in addition to the kind of larger context of me doing this soul searching, that might have also kind of helped as a catalyst, as it were. But so I sat there in my that plush white chair in my room, the room I'd grown up in, and I started to meditate. And one of the things that's been helpful for me that I would tell anybody who's interested and has not yet given meditation or any contemplative practice a try is I would suggest start with just a few minutes, whatever that looks like for you. And it can be very helpful to both have that consistency over time because even if nothing happens, again, talking about the mystery and the mundane, even if nothing happens internally, if no insights are ever gained, which I would be surprised if that were to not happen. However, even if that didn't happen, I think that showing oneself the consistency can be itself a treasure, a win, a gain. So that's one thing, and I know that academicians are kind of notorious for not having any time. So starting with just a few minutes, 5, 10 minutes, whatever it is, a day or however many times a week one can do that can be really helpful. And also having maybe somebody else who's interested or who's already been doing it to talk to about the practice can be helpful. And then looking into scholarship, like I have a book on my shelf by Dr. Paul Mills down at UC San Diego, my alma mater, who has written a book on essentially identity and scientists and kind of their reflections on life. And I know that one of the things I'd wanted to do at some point as I was finishing my doctorate, I did my contemplative work, right? I did my soul searching. I decided, hey, I think even though there are these awesome schools like CIIS, JFK University, what was then ITP, was now Sophia Institute, Sophia University. Even though there are these awesome schools here in the Bay Area, no less, I think I'm gonna go back and finish my more orthodox training in psychology and get my developmental psychology degree, my PhD in developmental psychology, excuse me. And so as I was finishing my degree, I was thinking, it might be cool to interview scientists, academicians about their contemplative practices and to see, well, what are some ways in which they utilize them if they don't already have a contemplative practice, do they want to? And the reason that this kind of, or part of the reason this all kind of came up for me, because part of my research was on meditation, on whether or not a short mindfulness session, a short guided imagery session, or no meditation at all impacted cognitive performance. Specifically, I was looking at short-term recall and comprehension of educationally relevant materials in this case, African American college students at Howard University. So that was part of it. And then the other part was looking at learning context, looking at individual and communal learning contexts, whether or not students learned the material on their own, excuse me, or with others. And so at the time that I had developed my topic, nobody in my department really was looking at mindfulness, at least as far as the students were concerned. But by the time I finished, we had a number of students who were and faculty as well who were looking at mindfulness as a factor to study in terms of research. So that was really cool. And I think that some of my influence was positive, either indirectly or directly. So yes, I think that those things can be helpful. 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, whatever people can do, and trying to do that consistently. That said, I know that at least for myself, 20 to 25 minutes is usually what I really needed typically to get in the zone, as it were, where I noticed a very clear shift in brain states. Maybe, for example, going from beta to alpha for those who are familiar with brain states. So that is to say that if an individual has time, that more time might be more beneficial in the long run. And also that a sitting meditation isn't the only way to be contemplative, but that there are many ways to be contemplative, from walking to journaling to being in prayer, even to how we talk with and interact with one another. So I would say that whatever curiosities a person has, there are numerous resources out there that can be very helpful, and but just starting with a little bit of time initially can be very helpful.
I remember during my talk with Dr. Judson Brewer, he said he got into medical school and then he decided he's going to go meditate. And he was having so much struggle. And he was kind of like freaking out that he's like, I can get into medical school, but I can't meditate. What's wrong with this situation? And then he taught himself how to meditate and it transformed his life. We did an interview with Dr. Samira Hosseini, who she only publishes in very hard STEM, top tier journals, quarter one, quarter two, hundreds of articles. And she said she equates all her success to meditation, all
Uh,
of it. So I think there is something to that for sure.
yeah,
Um,
thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. So just coming back to transpersonal psychology real quick, I'm curious, what is the current state of the field in your eyes and where do you think it's going?
Thank you. Yeah, I think the current state of the field is promising. That said, I think that we can continue to advocate for ourselves, kind of some of what I might have mentioned earlier. I think that continued collaboration with, if not bringing in, of individuals who are trained either transpersonal psychology or who have an interest in it, an interest in the phenomena under study. Collaboration is key. I think that dissemination is key. And again, I don't think that dissemination is always needed to be done within the ivory tower. I think that social media, given the power of social media, like what we're doing right now, social media can be very impactful. And I think that some of the works, for example, that CIIS have been doing a podcast, that kind of work is important and needs to continue. I think that what transpersonal psychology looks like beyond the global north is going to need to continue to be important, even just looking in terms of numbers. So if we look at the number of people who are, for example, in the Indian subcontinent and in China and Africa, those continents, subcontinents alone have an extraordinary number of people who, even if most of them are lay people, have some awareness or understanding of at least some of the things that we talk about in transpersonal psychology. South America, the Pacific Islands, Oceania. And so in our work in the Department of Research Psychology at CIIS, we do what we can to bring in at least some of the published literature that comes from some of these places and to highlight it, to hold it up. We need to continue doing that. We need more of it as long as it is quality and speaks to human flourishing, either directly or indirectly. And so those are some of the things that come to mind for me. I think that continued collaborations between institutions, educational institutions of higher ed, that is, and research institutes and individual practitioners and citizen scientists, like all of this needs to occur in ways that are beneficial for all parties involved. And I think that can continue to happen in a number of ways. In-person collaborations, online collaborations, hybrid collaborations. And so part of that again is kind of that people might need to give up a little ego to go a long way to what you were saying earlier. And I think that some of the ways in which we can go far might very well include the very same phenomena that we study in the contemplative sciences and transpersonal psychology, etc. So again, like beginner's mind or going like super far with that, the ego death, right? There are any number of phenomena that can speak directly to how we can help build flourishing communities. And And so continuing to dig into those and or to address others that aren't as well understood or studied would be really helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. I'm going to take this a little further. What do you want to see the maybe current academics and future academics, scholars, researchers do in this field? Research, contribute, etc.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. There's oftentimes in a focus on ontology, and I'm speaking again coming from my interest in entity encounters. What is going on when people are encountering X, Y, and Z, right? Out there in the woods, in their homes, wherever, on the road when they're driving to and from work at night. Ontology, though, I think can only get us so far. I think that epistemology and axiology, I'm speaking from a philosophy of science perspective, perhaps here, but epistemology and axiology need to be focused on by academicians, and particularly those who are seeking to support experiencers. So what I mean by that is that, so for example, I'm involved in an organization, the E3 Alliance, that focuses on supporting mental health practitioners who are also interested in supporting experiencers. And experiencers being anybody who has had an encounter with a quote unquote entity. And that's broadly speaking. That could have been an entity encountered through psychedelic use. That could have been a haunting. That could have been a so-called ET or close encounter of the second, third, fourth, etc. kind. That could be a Sasquatch entity encounter. It could be Fey folk. It doesn't matter. The point is that we're trying to provide both broad as well as detailed support for individuals who are seeking to educate themselves, who are seeking to network with other people who want to educate themselves around how to better support people who have oftentimes been marginalized or might be even afraid of approaching mental health practitioners in the first place for fear of being ridiculed or called crazy, et cetera, not receiving support in general. There's real fear, there's real stigma there, which I think is lessening somewhat. But when it comes to talking about human flourishing, I think there's a lot that the community of experiencers and those helping to support experiencers can learn from other communities who have been societally marginalized. People of color, indigenous communities, people who are otherly gendered, who have been othered due to their gender, et cetera, sexual orientation, right? There are things that can be learned from a developmental perspective and from like in terms of practices and policies and positions that are taken up by, for example, academic institutions, ways in which individuals can be supported better in this one community. And there's not to say that there's not overlap between, there's people of color who are experiencers, for example. Shout out, there's the Experiencers of Color Collective with the John E. Mack Institute that I have recently become aware of and joined myself. And that is focused on individuals who are people of color who are also experiencers. Okay. So again, not to say that there's any mutual distinction or exclusivity between these communities per se, but I think that generally European Americans and Europeans have gotten kind of the lion's share of visibility when it comes to being experienced. Okay. So what I think can happen is that there can be a degree of education that is provided, but how that education happens can be further researched, and the impacts of that education can be further researched by academicians, again, in collaboration with citizen scientists or people like those of us at the E3 Alliance, et cetera, as long as something is understood and we're not further marginalizing or taking advantage of experiencers, right? And so when it comes to sharing educational resources with these groups, we also have to be careful to protect them and to be discerning in what resources we bring to them. And so, because experiencer communities, and again, I'm focusing heavily in my answer here on experiencer communities because that's been a large focus of mine, particularly over the last few years in terms of my professional work. Okay. But experiencers are often marginalized anyway. I mean, the number of times where I've heard people say that they didn't feel comfortable talking even to their spouse or a best friend, some other family member. They didn't feel comfortable talking to a coworker, even if the coworker might have seen something themselves or experienced something themselves. So if they have these misgivings about sharing with these people, of course, they wouldn't share with a mental health professional or with a medical doctor, et cetera, right? With their boss. So these are the kinds of barriers to human flourishing that can be further understood and researched in a way that is not only practical, but that doesn't further experiencers. As long as there is collaboration, such as, some of the participatory action research, these kinds of things, qualitative research where experiencers are co-researchers, these kinds of things can potentially be important as long as all the writing is clear, as there is transparency and honesty, the kinds of things that institutional review boards look out for in terms of supporting human and other participants. So those are a few things that come to mind. And again, I think that if experiencers can be better supported, the kinds of traumas and even good things, if those can be better understood and supported and integrated, then there are other traumas and experiences that people have that can be where there might be some learning transfer that can go on there. So again, all in support of human flourishing, and I think that those are some things that can potentially be done that I would hope continue to be understood and looked at better. And again, it doesn't necessarily matter all the time. Somebody may never know who or what they experienced that night, that day, that evening, right? That twilight. They may never know what those lights in the sky were, what that sound was at the door, you know, if or where they were taken somewhere.
Yeah.
But what we can help them focus on is how to potentially better integrate moving forward. And I'm saying this as a non-clinician, right? But we can help people who help them at the very least better understand how to help and integrate and how to not have that experience or set of experiences define their lives in a negative way or fully negative way. And so, again, epistemology is very important. If we're not listening to people at all because we're saying that eyewitness memory is fallible and unreliable, why do courts even utilize eyewitness testimony? I'm not saying that there are no issues with eyewitness testimony, but I am saying that we need to continue to look at the best research out there. So a quick shout out. I have so one of the people who her name is Dr. Laura Mickeyes, Mickes. She was a graduate student when I was at UC San Diego doing my college work at university. And she was at the time working in the research lab that I was also working in as a research assistant. And I thought she was just cool. And she had an interest in like Alzheimer's disease and stuff at the time. She eventually ended up going to another lab, but we tried to stay in touch for a little while. But she is still doing work, and that was over 20 years ago. She is still doing work on understanding memory, working with her then mentor and now colleague, Dr. John Wickstead, who was at the time the chair of the cognitive sciences department at UC San Diego. And so that the kind of work that they're doing, attempting to better understand how eyewitness testimony and eyewitness memory works in a very real sense, that kind of work can be really important and can help people to not just have this black and white thinking about, well, believe everything everybody says in terms of eyewitness memory, or believe nothing they say and throw it out the window, right? The point is that people have experiences. Sometimes we might misunderstand or misperceive those experiences, but by and large, people are simply trying, I think, simply trying to live a better, more fulfilling life. And so we need to continue to look at the best research that's out there and to integrate that when and where possible into the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work that we're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. I think that Dr. Mickey's will be next on our interview at some point. That will be a good one. Actually, a really interesting topic. Dr. Mitchell, before we close, we have a ritual here where the previous podcast guest asks a question to the next one. Surprise. Your question is quite in alignment, actually, with our talk today. Your question is, if there were no limitations to funding or quote unquote acceptance, what hypothesis would you try to prove?
My goodness, that's a great question. I guess the thing that comes to mind for me immediately that overlaps with a lot of these questions around entity encounters, some of the work that my colleague, Mr. Joshua Cutchin, has been doing, Mr. Christopher Noel, shout outs to them, is this question around survival of consciousness. And while it's not something that I have looked at directly, it is something that I think is really important for most people because I think death anxiety is a very real thing. And also, quick shout out to one of my other students, Nada Wasi, who has been doing her doctoral work is involving near-death experiences. So I just wanted to give her a quick shout out. That said, I would, if there were no limitations to studying, to funding, I would want to study the survival question, the survival of consciousness question. The hypothesis has been that there is survival of something that goes beyond the death of the physical body. And many people, poetic scientists, contemplative researchers, practitioners since time immemorial have been very interested, of course, in this question. And I think that the connection to human flourishing would be potentially, at least for some people, if some people knew one way or another that there was or was not something going on after the death of the physical body, then that might help them with some release of mortality salient, some release of death anxiety. Now, I think that given the current state of the research, that the question has already been more or less closed. That said, I think that there is always going to be the cynics and the pseudo skeptics and things like that who are either uninterested uninterested or afraid of the results. So I think that if there was no barrier in terms of funding, that a good chunk of the research would go into disseminating the study findings and having global dialogues, regional as well as global inter-regional dialogues about survival beyond the physical body.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell, if people want to find you, how can they do so?
Yes, so I can be reached at dsbmitchell@gmail.com. I also can be found on LinkedIn, and my profile is pretty easy to find, I think. But if people have any questions, that Gmail account would be the best way to get in touch with me.